Here's what bothers me about the story of Esther. Everyone reads it as a triumph. A girl becomes queen, saves her people, justice prevails. But that's not what actually happens. And I think we miss something crucial because we're looking for the wrong kind of story.
What do you mean? Doesn't she save the Jews from genocide?
She does. But let me ask you something first. Have you ever noticed that God is never mentioned once in the entire book of Esther? Not once. It's the only book in the Bible where God doesn't appear, doesn't speak, doesn't perform a miracle. Nothing.
That's actually weird when you think about it. Shouldn't God be the hero?
That's the point, and I think it's intentional. Because the real story of Esther isn't about God showing up. It's about what happens when God seems completely absent and you have to act anyway.
So what's the context here? Is this a historical thing?
The Persian Empire under Xerxes was one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. We're talking about a court where one man's word could mean life or death for thousands. The king could wake up angry and execute his entire cabinet. There was no check on his power, no rule of law, just the king's mood.
So Esther's in this world where she has no actual power.
Exactly. She's a Jewish girl, hiding her identity, living in a foreign palace. And then Haman, the king's advisor, gets angry at her uncle Mordecai and decides the solution is genocide. He convinces the king to issue a decree. One decree. All Jews across the empire will be executed on a single day.
How does a genocide even get decided that casually?
That's the reality of authoritarian power. It's arbitrary. Haman doesn't have some logical grievance. He's just offended that Mordecai won't bow to him. So he decides an entire ethnic group should die. And the king, because he doesn't really care about governance, just says yes.
And Esther finds out about this?
Mordecai comes to her and says, "Your people are going to be wiped out. You're the only one who can do anything because you're in the palace." And here's where the story gets interesting. Esther doesn't immediately say yes.
What do you mean? She doesn't want to help?
She hesitates. She tells Mordecai, "If I go to the king without being summoned, he can have me executed. It's the law." And she's not exaggerating. She could literally die just for walking into the throne room uninvited.
So she's afraid?
She's terrified, and reasonable about it. But then Mordecai says something to her that changes everything. He says, "If you remain silent, deliverance will come from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows if you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this."
So he's saying God will work it out either way?
That's what's so strange about this line. He doesn't say God will save us. He doesn't say have faith. He basically says, "Esther, deliverance is coming no matter what. But you might not be part of it, and you might not survive if you don't try." It's not a promise of safety. It's a question. Why do you think you're here?
And she decides to go.
But here's the part nobody talks about. She says something extraordinary. She says, "I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish."
If I perish, I perish. That's pretty dramatic.
It's more than dramatic. It's the moment of real courage. Because she's not saying, "God will protect me." She's not saying, "Everything will work out." She's saying, "I might die, and I've decided that's acceptable because some things matter more than staying alive."
So her courage isn't about confidence?
Her courage is the opposite of confidence. Confidence is, "I know this will work out." Courage is, "I don't know if this will work out and I'm doing it anyway." And I think we've lost that distinction in Christianity.
So what happens when she goes to the king?
She goes uninvited. She stands in the courtyard waiting to see if he'll execute her. And something interesting happens. The king sees her and he's pleased. He doesn't kill her. He grants her an audience. She asks him to come to a banquet. He agrees.
So it works out?
Yes. But notice what didn't happen. God didn't part the Red Sea. He didn't send an angel. He didn't perform a miracle. Esther walked into a room and a man who could have killed her decided not to. That's it. That's the entire supernatural element of the story.
Isn't that kind of an ordinary thing? I mean, the king could have just been in a good mood.
Exactly, and that's the genius of the story, because it raises the question, how do you distinguish between divine providence and coincidence? How do you know if God is working when nothing miraculous is happening?
I think I see where you're going. Esther had to act as if God was working, even though she had no evidence.
Right. She had no sign, no promise, no certainty, just a question. Why are you here? And she acted. And through a series of ordinary events, a banquet, the king's insomnia, Haman's arrogance, the genocide is stopped.
But she doesn't even know that's going to happen when she goes to the king.
She doesn't know anything. She walks toward probable death with no assurance it will work. No angel tells her it will be fine. No prophet gives her a word. She just decides that whatever she's being called to is worth the cost.
So the story isn't about faith being rewarded. It's about faith without evidence.
It's about something even harder than that. It's about obedience without clarity. About acting in service of what's right when you have zero guarantee that your actions will matter. When you can't see God working. When everything is ambiguous and dangerous and unclear.
How is that different from regular courage? I mean, anyone would do that for their people.
That's not true, though. Most people, when facing an ambiguous, dangerous situation with no guarantee of success, find reasons not to act. They rationalize. They wait for clarity. They wait for God to show up more obviously. They wait for the moment when they feel absolutely certain. Esther doesn't wait.
And I think that's what's hard for us today, right? We want God to make it obvious. We want a clear sign. We want to feel like He's in control.
Exactly. We live with the assumption that if God is involved, it should feel divine. It should be unmistakable. And when it isn't, we assume He's not there. But the book of Esther is saying something radical. It's saying, what if God is present precisely in the ambiguity? What if His work looks so ordinary, so natural, so much like coincidence, that you can't distinguish it from randomness?
So how do you live like that? How do you act in that kind of uncertainty?
You do what Esther did. You ask yourself, why am I here? In this job, in this relationship, in this situation? And you consider the possibility that you're there for something that matters. And then you decide what you would do if God was absolutely present and absolutely committed to your success. And you do that thing.
Even if it might cost you?
Especially if it might cost you. Because the moment you need God to guarantee your safety before you act, you've made your safety more important than obedience. And Esther said no to that trade. She said, if I perish, I perish.
But she doesn't perish. The plan works.
It does work, but that's not why her decision was courageous. Her courage happened before she knew it would work. Her courage was in the uncertainty. And I think that's the part the story wants us to understand. Because we read it now knowing everything turns out fine. But Esther didn't know that. Esther had to choose faith in the middle of ambiguity.
So what does this mean for someone listening to this right now?
It means that a lot of you are waiting for God to make it obvious. You're waiting for a clear sign before you move. You're waiting for certainty before you act. But Esther's story suggests that's not how faith actually works. Faith is deciding that some things matter more than your comfort, more than your safety, more than your need to be certain, and then doing them anyway.
Like what? What's the modern version of this?
Someone who sees corruption in their workplace and has to decide, do I speak up and risk my job? Do I jeopardize my career for what's right? Someone in a relationship who knows something is wrong but is afraid to have the hard conversation. Someone who sees injustice and has to decide, do I act or do I stay silent and safe?
And in all those cases, God isn't going to make it obvious that it will work out.
No. In most cases, it probably won't work out the way you want. You might speak up and lose the job. You might have the hard conversation and the relationship might end. You might stand up for what's right and face serious consequences. Esther was fortunate. Many people who act on principle aren't.
So is the message just take the risk and hope for the best?
No. The message is some things are worth the risk, and you have to decide which ones. Esther decided that the potential genocide of her people was worth risking her life for. That's a legitimate calculation, but not every situation is an Esther situation. You have to ask yourself, is this something worth dying for? And if the answer is no, then maybe silence is actually the wise choice.
But if it is something worth dying for, then you act regardless of the outcome.
Then you act because the alternative, remaining silent while something terrible happens, is worse than the personal risk. You act because you've decided that your safety is less important than what's right. You act because you've asked yourself, why am I here? And you've decided that this is your answer.
And you don't need God to promise you it will work out.
You decide that even if God doesn't intervene, even if your actions fail, even if you suffer consequences, you've still made the right choice. You still chose what mattered. That's faith in its purest form, not faith that God will fix it. Faith that what you're doing is right even if it fails.
That's actually more faith than waiting for a miracle.
It's a different kind of faith, the kind that doesn't require proof, the kind that acts in the absence of confirmation, the kind that says, I don't know if God is here, but I'm going to live as if He matters, and I'm going to act accordingly.
So the book of Esther, with no mention of God, is actually the most honest book about faith?
Maybe. Because it shows faith stripped of comforting promises. It shows courage without certainty. It shows a woman who had to choose between safety and significance, and she chose significance. Not because she knew it would work, because she decided it was worth it.
And that's what we're all being called to, in different ways, to find our own Esther moment.
Exactly. To ask ourselves, why am I here? What am I willing to risk for? Who am I willing to stand up for? And then, to do that thing, regardless of whether God makes it obvious that it will work. Because faith isn't faith if it requires proof. Faith is acting when you have only a question and a conviction that some things matter more than staying safe.
If I perish, I perish.
If I perish, I perish. That's the full courage. That's the real faith. And it doesn't require a burning bush or an angel or a parted sea. It just requires you to decide that whatever you're being called to is worth the cost. Comment below. I will choose significance over safety. Share this with someone who's been waiting for God to make the path obvious. Subscribe so you don't miss the conversations that actually change how you see faith.